Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. We're tackling the 2008 global financial crisis. And we'll be using John Lanchester's book, I.O.U, Why Everyone Owes Everyone and No One Can Pay. It's a fascinating look at how this whole thing unfolded, and more importantly, what we can learn from it so it doesn't happen again.
It's kind of like a financial fire drill, you know? Helps us spot those warning signs early.
Right.
And maybe, hopefully, prevent future meltdowns.
Exactly. So let's rewind back to the early 2000s. Remember that crazy economic boom? Global GDP practically doubled, going from $36 trillion to $70 trillion by 2006. It's almost like the entire world economy suddenly had twins.
It was a time of just incredible growth, driven in large part by the rise of China and India. Think about it. Hundreds of millions of people entering the middle class, and new markets were popping up everywhere.
Yeah.
The demand for just about everything, from oil to clothes, it just skyrocketed.
Yeah, it felt like we were on the verge of solving global poverty, didn't it?
It really did.
But Lanchester points out that this boom, well, it wasn't all it was cracked up to be.
Right.
It was built on a mountain of debt, especially in the West.
That's a key point, yeah. While these emerging economies were booming, a lot of Western countries were racking up massive amounts of debt. Individually, nationally, it was like, it's like building a mansion on a swamp. Not the most stable foundation.
Okay, so let's zoom in on Iceland for a second. Lanchester uses it as like a mini version of the global crisis. How did a country like, I don't know, the size of Tampa, Florida, how'd they end up with a banking sector 12 times larger than its entire economy? That's insane. That's like your local credit union suddenly trying to bankroll the entire United States.
Well, imagine this. Icelanders taking out loans in foreign currencies to buy fancy cars, encouraged by these banks promising easy money. And then when their currency crashed, these loans became impossible to repay. The whole system just imploded.
Yeah, and Lanchester mentions this T-shirt slogan that was popular at the time, brown is the color of poo. Catchy, right? But it was apparently aimed at the UK Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Over how they handled the crisis and the losses for Iceland. They were staggering, like £116,000 per person. That's a lot of poo.
It really is. But Iceland's story, it shows us how dangerous unchecked financial growth can be, especially when it's detached from the real economy. It's a warning sign, and we should be paying attention.
So how did we even get to a point where this kind of recklessness was even possible? Lanchester talks about the fall of the Berlin Wall and this end of history feeling, like capitalism had won, and now it was time to party. Was that part of the problem?
Definitely. The collapse of the Soviet Union, I think it did create this sense of capitalism has triumphed, and it led to a wave of deregulation, especially in finance, starting in the 80s. It's kind of like suddenly removing all the speed limits and safety regulations on a highway. Not a great idea.
Yeah, sounds like the party got a little out of control.
It did. Financial institutions just kept getting bigger and more powerful, taking on more risk with less oversight. In the UK, there was this thing called the Big Bang in 1986 that massively deregulated the financial sector, and it created what we call a shadow banking system, basically a financial system operating outside the normal rules and regulations.
Okay, so if traditional banks are like, I don't know, like a well-lit, inspected restaurant, this shadow banking system is more like a food truck in a dark alley.
I'd say that's a pretty good analogy. The risks are definitely higher, and the transparency is much lower. This unregulated environment played a big role in the crisis.
Okay, so let's get back to the basics of banking for a minute. You know, before all the fancy financial stuff came along, banking was a pretty simple business. You deposit your money, the bank lends it out, everybody wins.
That's the basic idea, yeah. Taking deposits, making loans, and the quality of those loans. That's key. It's like the foundation of a house. If the loans are bad, the whole thing collapses.
Makes sense. But then came these complicated financial instruments, things like securitization and credit default swaps, or CDSs. Lanchester says these things basically broke the traditional banking model. Can you help us understand how they work? They always make my head spin.
Yeah, derivatives can be confusing. But think of it like this. Imagine you sell coffee and your neighbor sells stationery. You're both a little worried. Your businesses might slow down. So you'd agree to swap a portion of your future revenues. If your coffee sales dip, you get some support from the stationery income, and vice versa.
It's like a safety net.
Exactly. But this simple concept got transformed into incredibly complex instruments like credit default swaps or CDSs. And to illustrate how risky this can get, Lanchester talks about long-term capital management. This hedge fund was founded by, get this, Nobel Prize-winning economists. They thought they had figured out risk-free profits using derivatives.
Nobel Prize winners, huh? Sounds like a sure thing. What could go wrong?
Oh, a lot can go wrong. They had $4.72 billion in equity, but a staggering $1.25 trillion in risk exposure through derivatives. It's like betting your entire life savings on a single horse race. And guess what? They lost. Almost crashed the entire financial system back in the 90s.
Wow, that's a cautionary tale. So how did we go from swapping coffee and stationary revenues to this near collapse of the financial system? Seems like a giant leap.
It is a big leap, and it shows how simple financial tools can become incredibly risky when taken to extremes. And that's where securitization comes in. Initially, it was meant to spread risk by bundling loans together and selling them off. But in practice, it created a system where lenders didn't really care if borrowers could actually repay.
So that's the sayonara sucker mentality that
Yep.
Lanchester talks about. Lenders just passing on the risk like a hot potato. But this all started with safer assets, right? Like corporate debt. Why the shift to subprime mortgages?
Well, subprime mortgages. Those are loans given to people with poor credit. They were seen as a gold mine. They offered higher interest rates, which meant bigger profits. Lenders piled into this market, kind of ignoring the higher risk involved.
It's like a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
Mhm.
You take a bunch of risky loans, bundle them together, sell them off to investors who don't fully understand the danger. It's like selling a ticking time bomb disguised as a birthday present.
It's a good analogy.
And to assess the risk of these bundles, they used complex models, right? Including something called the Gaussian copula function. Now, I'm no math whiz, so could you break that down for us? What was flawed about this formula?
So imagine you're trying to predict tomorrow's weather based only on sunny days from the past. You'd be missing some crucial data about storms, right? Well, that's essentially what happened with this formula. It used historical data from a time when subprime mortgages hadn't been through a downturn. So it couldn't accurately predict the risk.
So they were basically driving blindfolded, using a map that didn't show the cliffs.
Pretty much. This flawed model, combined with the sayonara sucker mentality, led to a massive overvaluation of these subprime bundles. By 2007, the market for these bundles had ballooned to a staggering $62 trillion. That's more than the entire global economy at the time.
Wow. So you've got these bundles packed with risky subprime loans. They're everywhere. It's like a ticking time bomb embedded in the global financial system. But before we get to the explosion, let's talk about the people behind these mortgages. Weren't there some shady practices going on?
Oh, absolutely. Lanchester describes some pretty predatory lending practices that specifically targeted vulnerable borrowers, often in minority communities. He tells some pretty unsettling stories from Baltimore, where lenders basically preyed on people's dreams of homeownership.
Yeah, he talks about lenders targeting black churches, using all sorts of deceptive tactics,
Yeah.
pushing people into loans they couldn't afford. It's heartbreaking.
It is. And it reminds us that behind all these complex financial instruments are real people whose lives were devastated. And this predatory lending, it was a direct result of that demand for subprime mortgages to fuel those risky bundles we talked about.
So it's all connected. This wasn't just some abstract financial meltdown. Real people were getting hurt.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, how could this happen? Why didn't anyone see the warning signs? Or if they did, why didn't they do anything to stop it?
Well, it's complicated. You know how sometimes you get this funny feeling about something, like a gut instinct that something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. That's how it was for a lot of people. They sensed something was wrong with the subprime mortgage market, but couldn't pinpoint exactly what.
I get that. Lanchester talks about this disconnect between the abstract world of finance and the real-world impact of those decisions. I guess when you're dealing with trillions of dollars, it's easy to forget those numbers represent real people's lives and homes.
Yeah, it's easy to lose sight of the human cost. And there's another element at play here, the psychology of risk, and this idea of expert overconfidence.
Oh, right. He mentions that.
Lanchester talks about the work of Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for his work in psychology, studying how people make decisions under uncertainty.
So even the smartest people can get things wrong. That's kind of reassuring, actually. But what made this overconfidence so dangerous in the context of the financial crisis?
Well, it's not just about being smart. It's about recognizing the limits of your knowledge. Experts, they often overestimate their ability to predict outcomes, especially in complex systems like the financial market. And they tend to underestimate the possibility of unexpected events, like
Yeah.
a sudden crash in the housing market. And this overconfidence, it was amplified by their reliance on those flawed models we discussed.
So you've got this mix of overconfidence, flawed models, and a lack of regulation, like a perfect storm. But Lanchester points out that some people did see the warning signs. Some journalists, for example. Why weren't their warnings heeded? Was it just pure greed, or was something else going on?
Well, greed definitely played a part, no doubt.
Yeah.
But there's also this a sort of collective denial, a belief that because a crisis of this magnitude hadn't happened before, it couldn't happen. Plus, there was this strong ideological commitment to free markets and deregulation. It made it really difficult to challenge the status quo. It's like everyone was caught up in this financial euphoria, and nobody wanted to be the party pooper.
But someone should have been the party pooper. All that ignoring of the warning signs, it had to lead somewhere, right?
Unfortunately, it did. The bubble finally burst. It started with a rise in defaults on those subprime mortgages. Remember those bundles of loans we talked about?
Yeah.
As more borrowers couldn't make their payments, the value of those bundles just plummeted.
And since these bundles were everywhere, the losses just spread like wildfire, didn't they?
Exactly. Banks and other financial institutions were hit with massive losses and panic set in. Nobody knew who was holding those toxic assets. So they stopped lending to each other. The credit markets froze up. And the global economy went into a tailspin, like a domino effect. Each falling domino taking down another and another.
It's hard to grasp the scale of it. Lanchester describes it as a cataclysmic destruction of value. Billions, even trillions of dollars just gone. What happened next?
Well, governments around the world, they face this terrifying dilemma. Do they let the whole system collapse, or do they step in with massive bailouts?
Yeah.
And they chose the latter. They used taxpayer money to rescue the very institutions that caused the crisis.
So the people who made the mess got bailed out, and ordinary people were left to deal with the fallout. That's incredibly unfair.
It was a tough pill to swallow, for sure. And Lanchester is very critical of how things played out
Yeah.
in the aftermath of the crisis. He points to the lack of accountability for those responsible.
And the failure to learn from the mistakes that were made. It's amazing, isn't it? You'd think that after such a massive crisis, there'd be some serious soul-searching, some real changes to prevent it from happening again. Did any of that actually happen?
Not as much as you might hope. Lanchester points to the growing inequality that resulted from the crisis. The rich and powerful were able to protect their wealth, while the poor and middle class struggled. It really does feel like there are different rules for the people at the top.
It's like that saying, privatize profits, socialize losses.
Mm-hmm.
The people who took the risks reaped the rewards, and when it all blew up, taxpayers were left holding the bag.
Exactly. And it raises serious questions about the model of capitalism we've been following. Lanchester argues that we need to rethink the role of government in regulating the financial industry and protecting the public interest. We can't just rely on the invisible hand of the market to sort everything out.
He also talks about the decline of manufacturing and the over-reliance on financial services, particularly in the UK. Is that part of the problem too?
Definitely. When a country's economy becomes too dependent on finance, it's like building a house on sand. It becomes vulnerable to these booms and busts. We need a more balanced and diversified economy, one that's grounded in real production and innovation, not just financial speculation.
So what lessons can we learn from all of this? How do we prevent another 2008? Do we need a complete overhaul of the system, or are there smaller, targeted changes we can make?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Lanchester doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does highlight a few areas where reform is needed. Stronger regulation of the financial industry is a must, especially in areas like derivatives trading and leverage. It's like putting guardrails on that financial highway we talked about.
So no more driving blindfolded with no speed limit. Makes sense to me. But isn't that going to be a tough sell to the financial industry? They've always resisted regulation.
It will be a fight, for sure. But that's where public awareness comes in. We need to understand how the financial system works and demand change from our leaders. Lanchester emphasizes the importance of education and public engagement in pushing for these reforms. We can't just leave it to the experts and regulators.
So we all need to become more financially literate, not just to manage our own finances, but to understand the bigger picture, the systemic risks. It's like if you're going to drive a car, you need to understand the rules of the road, even if you're not a mechanic.
I like that analogy.
And that's what makes this deep dive so important. By understanding what led to the 2008 crisis, we can start asking the right questions, demanding more transparency, and pushing for a safer, more equitable financial system.
I agree. Knowledge is power.
So far, we've covered a lot of ground. The boom, the bust, the flawed models, the predatory lending, the devastating consequences. But there's one piece we haven't really talked about, the role of psychology.
You're right. We touched on expert overconfidence, but there's more to it than that. Greed and fear, they played a huge role in driving the crisis.
It's like those animal spirits John Maynard Keynes talked about. During the boom, everyone was greedy, optimistic, pushing prices higher and taking on more risk. But when the bubble burst, fear took over, leading to panic selling and that credit freeze we discussed.
It's the classic boom and bust cycle, fueled by human emotions, as much as by any rational calculation of risk and reward. And what's fascinating is that the structure of the financial markets can actually amplify these emotions.
Really? Are you saying the markets themselves are partly to blame?
In a way, yes. Think about it, the financial markets, they're essentially a giant feedback loop. When prices go up, people get more confident and buy more, pushing prices up even further. But when prices start to fall, fear kicks in and people sell, driving prices down even faster. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The act of trading itself can create a boon or a bust, regardless of the underlying fundamentals of the economy.
So it's like a roller coaster ride, exhilarating on the way up, terrifying on the way down. And it seems like the only people who enjoy the ride are the ones who know when to get off before the big drop.
That's a good way to put it. And that's why regulation is so crucial. We need rules and safeguards to dampen those emotional swings and prevent the markets from spiraling out of control. It's about creating a smoother, safer ride for everyone, not just the thrill seekers.
Lanchester also talks about the cult of finance, this idea that people in the financial industry see themselves as a separate, superior class. Does that contribute to the problem?
Absolutely. This elitist mentality can breed a really dangerous sense of entitlement and a willingness to bend or break the rules because they know better. But we saw this a lot in the lead up to the crisis. Bankers pushing the limits of regulation, taking on ever greater risks. And even when it all blew up, they still walked away with massive bonuses.
I remember the outrage over Sir Fred Goodwin's pension after the collapse of Royal Bank of Scotland. The CEO who led the bank to near collapse still received a huge pension. It's like rewarding someone for crashing the car.
It was a classic example of how this system rewards failure. And it fueled a lot of public anger over the bailouts and the lack of accountability.
People see that and think, the rules don't apply to these guys. They get rewarded for failure while we're left picking up the pieces. So how do we change that? How do we create a system where success is rewarded and failure is punished? Even in the world of high finance, it feels like a David versus Goliath situation, trying to hold these powerful institutions accountable.
It's definitely a challenge, but there are things we can do. One is to require banks and financial institutions to hold more capital reserves. This gives them a bigger cushion to absorb losses and reduces the likelihood of them needing a bailout. It's like making sure they have enough airbags in case of a crash.
We could also limit the use of leverage, right? That would reduce the size of the bets they can make, sort of like setting lower betting limits at a casino.
Exactly. And we could impose stricter penalties for reckless behavior, including criminal charges in cases of fraud or negligence. The goal is to align the risks and rewards so that individuals and institutions have a strong incentive to act responsibly. It's about making sure the consequences of their actions match the severity of their mistakes.
But Lanchester argues that true reform goes deeper than just changing the rules. He says we need to rethink the whole culture of finance and the values that drive it.
He's right. We need to move away from this short-term focus on profits and bonuses and toward a more sustainable model that serves the needs of the real economy. It's about asking, what's the purpose of finance? Is it just about making a quick buck, or is it about serving society, supporting businesses, and creating a more stable and equitable world?
That's a big question, and it feels like it goes beyond just finance. It's about our values as a society, what we prioritize, what we consider success. It's about challenging this idea that greed is good and that the pursuit of wealth is the only thing that matters.
I think that's at the heart of it.
So where do we go from here? What can we as individuals do to make a difference? It feels daunting, like we're up against this giant impersonal system.
It can feel that way for sure. But remember, this system is made up of people. And those people are influenced by public opinion, by voters, by consumers. One of the most powerful things we can do is to become more informed about how the financial system works, understanding the risks involved, and the potential consequences of our financial decisions is key. It's like empowering ourselves to be more savvy consumers of financial products and services.
So we need to educate ourselves, not just about personal finance, but about the bigger picture, how the system works and how our choices can impact it.
Exactly. We can also support policies that promote responsible finance, like stronger regulation, limits on leverage, and greater transparency. And we can choose to invest our money in companies and institutions that are committed to sustainable and ethical practices. We have more power than we think to shape the future of finance.
Lanchester's book seems like a great place to start. For anyone who wants to learn more, it's really engaging, informative, and thought-provoking, even if you're not a finance expert. I know I learned a lot from reading it.
I agree. It's a book that everyone should read, especially given the challenges we still face in the global economy. It's not just about understanding the past, it's about equipping ourselves to create a better future.
So the 2008 financial crisis, it was a complex event with multiple causes. Deregulation, flawed models, greed, expert overconfidence, they all played a part. But it also revealed some deep structural problems in our economic system, problems that we need to address if we want to avoid a repeat.
It was a wake-up call for sure. A reminder that the pursuit of profit shouldn't come at the expense of social justice and economic stability. We need to rethink our values, our policies, our institutions to create a more sustainable and equitable world.
It really feels like we're at a crossroads. We can either slip back into old habits, hoping the next crisis won't be as bad, or we can use this experience as a chance to build a better system. What do you think?
I think Lanchester definitely wants us to rethink our whole approach. He argues we need to move away from this greed is good mentality and find a more balanced, more humane way to grow the economy. It's not just about making money. It's about creating a society that works for everyone.
He talks about this idea of the hedonic treadmill, right? We keep chasing more and more and more, but we never quite feel satisfied. It's like we're running on a treadmill, working hard, but not getting anywhere.
It's a great metaphor. It really captures that emptiness of endless consumerism. Maybe this crisis can be a chance to pause and reflect on our values, to figure out what truly matters. Do we really need all this stuff? What makes us truly happy?
It's like we've been so busy climbing the ladder of success that we forgot to ask ourselves if it's even leaning against the right wall. Maybe success isn't just about having more, but about living a more meaningful life.
That's a good way to put it.
He also points out that even after this massive crisis exposed all the flaws in the system, there hasn't been a strong ideological challenge to the way we do things. It's like we learned the lesson, but didn't change our behavior.
That's a really crucial point. We need fresh ideas, new models, different ways of thinking about the economy and its role in society. Maybe this crisis is a chance to have those conversations and explore alternatives.
Lanchester doesn't give us a roadmap exactly, but he does leave us with some thought-provoking questions.
He does.
What stood out most to you in this deep dive? What are you still thinking about?
I think for me, it's the reminder that the economy is a human creation. It's not some force of nature that we can't control. We have the power to shape it, to make it work for everyone, not just a select few. It's about taking responsibility, not just for our own finances, but for the well-being of their communities and the planet.
You know, it makes you wonder, knowing what we know now, could we have prevented this crisis? And what safeguards do we need to put in place to prevent another one? Those are questions I think we all need to grapple with. We need to be engaged citizens, informed about these issues, and willing to demand change from our leaders. We can't just assume someone else will fix it. It's up to all of us to learn from the past and build a more resilient and just future.
I completely agree.
Lanchester doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does leave us with some really thought-provoking questions.
He does.
Like, what stood out most to you from this deep dive? What are you still kind of mulling over?
I think for me, what really stuck with me is this idea that the economy, it's not this, poop kit, this force of nature we can't control. It's a human creation. We built it. And we have the power to reshape it, to make it work for everyone, not just a select few. It's about, it's about taking responsibility, not just for our own finances, but for the well-being of our communities and the planet as a whole.
Yeah, that's a powerful point. It makes you think, knowing what we know now, could we have actually prevented this crisis? And what kind of safeguards do we need to, to make sure it doesn't happen again? Those are questions I think we all need to grapple with, honestly.
We do.
We need to be more engaged, more informed about these issues, and willing to demand better from our leaders. I think one of the most important takeaways from Lanchester's book is that we can't just sit back and wait for someone else to fix it.
Right. We can't be passive.
We all have a role to play in shaping a more just and sustainable financial system.
Absolutely.
And speaking of shaping the future, Lanchester talks about this idea of redefining what enough means,
Yeah.
especially as, the planet's resources are becoming more and more scarce.
Yeah, he makes a really compelling case for that. It's about shifting our mindset
Mm-hmm.
from this constant pursuit of more and more and more
Mm.
to a more balanced and sustainable approach. It's about finding contentment
Yeah.
with what we have and making sure that everyone has enough to live a dignified life.
Yeah. He uses this really striking image, the hedonic treadmill, this
Yeah.
idea that we keep chasing after more and more stuff, more and more experiences, but we never actually arrive at satisfaction.
Yeah, it's like we're running on a treadmill, working hard,
Yeah.
but not actually getting anywhere.
We're stuck in this cycle of wanting and striving, always looking for the next thing that will make us happy. But maybe true happiness comes from appreciating what we already have and focusing on things that really matter. Relationships, community, purpose.
I think that's a really important point. And it ties into this idea of redefining success.
Right. Success isn't just about, having the biggest house or the fanciest car.
And it's about living a life that is meaningful and fulfilling. It's about contributing to something larger than ourselves.
And Lanchester argues that this crisis, as devastating as it was, could actually be an opportunity to rethink our priorities as a society, to step off that hedonic treadmill and find a more sustainable and equitable path forward.
It's a chance to hit the reset button, in a way, to learn from our mistakes and build a better future.
What do you think are some of the key things we need to change to make that happen?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to values.
Yeah.
We need to shift away from this greed is good mentality that has dominated our culture for so long. We need to rediscover the importance of things like community, cooperation, and shared responsibility.
And how do we do that? How do we actually change the values of an entire society?
The big challenge. But I think it starts with education. We need to teach our children about the importance of these values, and we need to create a culture that rewards collaboration and compassion over competition and greed.
And what about the role of government? Lanchester seems to think that government has a key role to play in shaping a more just and sustainable economy.
He does. He argues that we need stronger regulations to prevent the kind of reckless risk-taking that led to the 2008 crisis. And he believes the government should invest in things like education, healthcare, and infrastructure to create a more equitable and resilient society.
So it's not just about, punishing bad behavior. It's about actively promoting good behavior.
Yeah.
It's about creating an environment where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
That's the goal.
Lanchester also points out something that I found really interesting. He says that even though the 2008 crisis exposed all these flaws in our economic system, there hasn't been a strong ideological challenge to the way things are done. It's like we learned the lesson, but we didn't actually change our behavior.
It's true. There's been a lot of talk about reform, but not a lot of real action.
So what's holding us back? Why are we so resistant to change?
Well, I think there are a few factors at play. One is inertia. It's always easier to stick with the status quo than to try something new, even if status quo isn't working. Another factor is, I guess you could call it a lack of imagination. It's hard to envision a different way of doing things, especially when the current system benefits those in power.
So we need to challenge those in power. We need to demand better.
We do. And we need to be willing to experiment, to try new approaches, even if they seem radical or unconventional.
And that brings us back to Lanchester's point about redefining what enough means. It's not just about individual choices. It's about creating a system that encourages and rewards sustainable and equitable practices.
Right. We need to rethink our economic goals. Instead of just focusing on GDP growth, we need to prioritize things like well-being, social justice, and environmental sustainability.
So it's not just about making money. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to live a good life.
That's a good way to put it.
And that's what makes this deep dive so important, right? By understanding the mistakes of the past, we can hopefully avoid repeating them in the future.
I hope so.
Lanchester's book is a great starting point for anyone who wants to learn more about these issues.
It is.
But it's just a starting point. We all need to continue learning, engaging in these conversations, and working towards a more just and sustainable future.
I couldn't agree more.
It's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
demand change from our leaders. We can't just assume someone else will fix it. It's up to all of us to learn from the past and build a more resilient and just future.
I completely agree.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the 2008 financial crisis. It's a complex and challenging topic, but one we can't afford to ignore.
Absolutely.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the reckless lending practices to the flawed models, the bailouts, the lack of accountability.
And the human cost.
Yeah, the human cost. It's easy to get lost in the numbers, but it's important to remember that real people were affected by this crisis.
Millions of people lost their homes, their jobs, their savings.
It's a reminder that the economy isn't just some abstract concept. It's about people's lives.
It is.
So what are your final thoughts? What do you hope listeners take away from this deep dive?
I hope they come away with a better understanding of how the financial system works and how their own choices can impact it.
I like that. We can't just be passive observers.
Right. We all have a role to play in shaping a more just and sustainable financial system.
Absolutely. And that starts with being informed and engaged.
Exactly.
Lanchester's book is a great place to start. But it's just the beginning of the conversation. We need to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep demanding better.
We do.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.